Hi, I'm Raamy Majeed. I'm a philosophy lecturer at the Open University and I work in philosophy of mind. So one of the things I work on is phenomenal consciousness. So phenomenal consciousness is the way experiences seem to us, or the way things feel to us. So when you have an espresso, there's a bitter taste quality to your experience. When you run your feet in the sand, there's a grainy tactile quality to that. So phenomenal consciousness is the subjective nature of your conscious experiences. And recently, since the 90s, there's been a problem called the hard problem of consciousness due to David Chalmers, who's an Australian philosopher of mind. And the hard problem, the way he understands it, is the problem of explaining how and why physical processing, so things like neural states, give rise to these kinds of subjective conscious experiences. So how they give rise to phenomenally conscious experiences. So the important thing to know is that the problem isn't identifying the neural correlates of your conscious experiences, which we are kind of on the right track in terms of identifying. The problem is explaining why it is that these neural correlates give rise to phenomenally conscious experiences as opposed to other types of neural states. So, since the problem was posed in the 90s, there's been a significant source of controversy over whether we're in any way closer towards solving. So no one thinks the problem's been solved, but whether we're even close to solving the problem. And I think one of the difficulties is that there's actually two different problems that people conflate owing to two different explanatory targets. So the one thing that people try and account for is how physical processing, so things like neural states, relate to phenomenally conscious experiences. So the relationship between the physical and the phenomenal. The other problem is understanding the nature of consciousness itself, so trying to explain the very thing, phenomenal character itself. And certain responses to the hard problem tackle both those explanatory targets, but the solutions can also come apart. So it might be possible to give an account which speaks to the relationship between the phenomenal and the physical without explaining the phenomenal itself. And views that are termed non-reductive, so you might get a view like non-reductive physicalism or property dualism, and these are views which try and explain the relationship between the physical and the phenomenal, but they leave the phenomenal as an unexplained primitive, and that's why they are non-reductive accounts. Whereas reductive accounts, like reductive physicalism, try and explain both the relationship between the phenomenal and the physical, but also the nature of the phenomenal itself. So in other words, they try and explain the phenomenal in more basic terms, like claims about neural processing. So you get these two different explanatory targets that are associated with the hard problem, and addressing them seems to be things which can come apart. Another problem that relates to issues to do with consciousness is the problem, or I should say the challenge posed by the explanatory gap. And the explanatory gap is a problem due to Joseph Levine, who's an American philosopher of mind, and it really arises from asking the following question. So suppose you get a physical processing of a certain kind, like neural processing. Why do you get conscious experiences from those particular types of neural processing? Now, when you understand the challenge in this way, it relates to the hard problem of consciousness, which is a problem of explaining how and why physical processing gives rise to experiences with a phenomenal character. But sometimes the hard problem is understood as the problem of consciousness itself, the problem of explaining consciousness, which you might be able to do without supposing that the physical processing has anything to do with consciousness itself. So there's a way in which the explanatory gap and the hard problem can be teased apart, where you might offer a solution to the hard problem, i.e. you might try and explain consciousness itself without really speaking to how or why physical processing gives rise to experiences with a phenomenal character. And a view like this is the information integration theory, and the idea is consciousness should be understood as informational states, where you take informational states themselves to be a primitive and something that's left unexplained in more basic notions. So a view like that what's unique about a view like that is it tries to explain consciousness itself in terms of more basic notions, i.e. information, without really explaining how physical processing gives rise to information itself. So a view like that arguably responds to the hard problem, but doesn't really respond properly to the explanatory gap. So I think it's important to note that though these two problems are problems to do with the same thing, namely phenomenal consciousness, these two problems come apart as well. So what I'm working on at the moment is in the philosophy of emotions. So there was this view that I think gets attributed to early modern philosophy, which I think is actually not entirely correct, but it's this view that emotions hinder reasoning. So they either are irrelevant to reasoning or they, if anything, disrupt reasoning. And in the 70s and basically then onwards, there's been basically a full-blown attack on this earlier view by both philosophers and psychologists. So these days, it's fairly common to think that emotions somehow assist reasoning. And what I'm really interested in is what understanding cognitive architecture of the mind, so what cognitive science and computational theories of the mind might imply for understanding how emotions might assist with reasoning. And one way of understanding the role of emotions here is in response to what's called the philosopher's frame problem by a philosopher called Ronald de Souza. And the frame problem is really a problem in artificial intelligence, and the problem here is slightly different. So the philosopher's frame problem is basically the idea that for any given situation you're trying to respond to, there's an infinite or an almost infinite amount of information you can pay attention to. And the problem is reason alone can't dictate when or which pieces of information that you should pay attention to. And the reason is, if reason's doing all the work, reason has to pick each piece of information and guess whether it's relevant or assess whether it's relevant. And it has to do that for each piece of information, and that would take way too long. And it would be too cognitively demanding as well. So what emotions really do? Well, one view is that emotions highlight certain pieces of information already. So emotions, think about it this way, emotions act as a biasing mechanism which biases certain pieces of information over others, and then you can reason about those pieces of information and decide what to do in a given situation. So that's how emotions help solve the philosopher's frame problem. And what I'm interested in is what cognitive architecture might have to do with how emotions go about solving this problem. And one notion that you get in cognitive science is this notion of information encapsulation. And the idea roughly is that processing systems which are informationally encapsulated are insensitive to information stored in other areas of the mind. And the basic idea is if emotional processing sometimes is encapsulated, it'll be insensitive to what you believe or what you desire. It'll just respond to certain things directly without considering things like what you believe. And one advantage is that you're able to emotionally respond to something very quickly without considering the kinds of things you believe. But another important factor is that it makes sure that these biases that you might have, which might be due to environmental situations where you were raised, or they might be evolutionary, but the point is you have these biases, and these biases aren't overridden by the kinds of things you actively believe at a given state. And it might be the case that those kinds of things you actively believe might not be very useful to consider when you're trying to respond to a situation very quickly. So that's one way something in cognitive science, namely this idea of information encapsulation, might provide a story about how emotions go about determining which pieces of information is relevant and thereby helping solve the philosopher's frame problem.